Marcus felt every whisper like sandpaper against a life he had built with careful hands. They spoke around him with the soft politeness of executioners, peeling away respect as if it were thin paint. A laugh at the edge of a question turned his full name into something small and disposable. Their eyes cataloged him, no longer a man, only a lesson for someone else to learn and forget. Something cold and sharp settled behind his ribs, the slow knowing that dignity could be taken with a single, careless word. What they mistook for silence was not weakness, but the first ember of a quiet that would not stay dead. What happened next shocked everyone and set off a chain of events no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we start the story, comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from today. And if you find this story impactful, don't forget to subscribe for more. Night kept its hold on the city when Marcus Carter woke with the taste of a courtroom in his mouth. It was the kind of dream that sat heavy, oak benches, a single lamp, a man standing alone while voices left him hollow. He lay very still, listening to the pipes in his small apartment talk back to him like old neighbors who knew too many secrets. Outside, a faint light bled under the curtains. The world was not yet ready to speak, but Marcus was already moving. I will say this plainly because it is true. Marcus cleaned the places people forgot to look. He swept where grief left footprints. He wiped handprints off windows of rooms that decided a person's value with a pen. There is dignity in steady work, and he carried that dignity like a second skin. He kept his shoulders square even when the bill collectors called. He hummed hymns under his breath, sometimes, not out of devotion, but because the songs made the brooms sound less alone. By the time he reached the courthouse, the sky was a bruised blue. The marble steps still held last night's rain in little silver pools. Marcus pushed open the heavy glass door with a mop bucket groaning behind him. The building smelled of old paper and lemon cleaner, the kind of lemon that promised order and never quite delivered it. He moved with a careful rhythm. Dust the brass plaques, empty the overflowing bin by the magistrate's office, straighten a chair that leaned like it had a story to tell. He knew the building's small holiness, its linoleum scars that mapped decades of hurried shoes, the faded carpet in the back hallway, where people waited to hear whether their lives would tilt. Up close, Marcus's hands told their story. Thick knuckles, a thin white scar along his left palm from a winter when a pipe burst, and he did not have time to think about himself. The scar had a way of reminding him that small choices became big ones. He kept a rag tucked in his back pocket and a tarnished silver cross on a cord around his neck. It caught the fluorescent light sometimes and winked like a private joke. There was a nervous energy today. Lawyers arrived early, their shoes clicking like an impatient metronome. A television crew truck idled near the steps with its satellite dish yawning at the sky. Someone had slipped a laminated photo into the bulletin board. A man in a tailored suit, salt and pepper hair, the kind of face that fit magazine covers. Marcus recognized the name below the photo, Robert Langford, and felt the familiar prickle that comes before something breaks. The courthouse had its routines, but today it had the scent of something urgent, the way the air feels before rain. Marcus worked as if to keep the noise at bay. He polished the brass rail where people gripped hope and fear in the same hand. He straightened the ropes in the waiting area where witnesses sat cross-legged, fingers worrying at polished phone cases. A bailiff gave him a quick nod, that small, functional exchange people pass between strangers who must behave as if the world is still a place of rules. The truth, which the compassionate narrator will not hide, is that Marcus carried more than mop buckets. He carried an old loyalty to people who had none left. He had once been a man with plans, day school, night classes, a job in accounting that never materialized because life had a way of changing the ledger. A sick mother, a sudden funeral, an eviction notice stamped with a thick, indifferent hand, these were the things that had rewritten his story. Yet he never let those pages show on his face. He believed small acts could be louder than big promises. At noon, when lawyers wore their collars like armor and the courthouse clock moved with the steady cruelty of time, Marcus found himself wiping down a bench near Courtroom 3. Through the open door, He heard the low hum of conversation, the legal kind that tastes like sharpened pencils. He watched people file in, jurors with nervous smiles, a woman clutching a paper bag like it held her courage, an expensive suited man who walked as if the floor owed him apologies. That was when he saw Michael Hale, the billionaire, more human than the photo on the bulletin board could ever allow. Michael was smaller standing in the doorway than Marcus expected, not because of stature, but because he looked tired in ways money could not mend. His suit was immaculate, but his hands trembled when he adjusted his tie. Someone had placed a thick leather briefcase on the council table and then walked away. Marcus's eyes found the briefcase and then the empty chair where counsel should have been. The absence was loud. A woman's voice announced a delay, the kind that sends a shiver through anyone with stakes on the line. Marcus watched Michael sit down and fold his hands in a way that looked like prayer. A court reporter's fingers tapped like a nervous bird. Someone whispered that the lawyer would not appear, that there had been an argument, that loyalty faltered in the places money rarely went. Marcus felt the same hollow in his chest the dream had left. He couldn't explain why the sight of a rich man with no one to stand for him pricked at him. Perhaps it was the mirror. He had stood alone before in rooms where decisions were made and found no one to speak his name. Perhaps it was the stubborn, human thing that lives in him, an unwillingness to let someone be abandoned in front of everyone, no matter the cost. He moved on, as he always did, folding himself into work. The mop soaked up coffee stains left like small, dark clouds. He emptied a trash can that smelled of perfume and fear. He straightened the margin of a legal pad left open like a wounded book. But his eyes kept returning to that empty chair. In the quiet afternoon bell, Marcus felt a pulsing question forming, slow as a tide. What does it mean to be left? And who, if not someone who understands being alone, will say, I will defend him? Even the impartial observer notes the small details, a scuffed shoe under a bench, a half-eaten sandwich discarded by a hurried clerk, a press badge forgotten near the water fountain. These are the markers of a day that will remember itself. By dusk, the building would have its stories, and Marcus's hands would be sore, the mop handle smooth from use. For now, he was a man with a mop and a memory, and the courthouse had put one lonely man in his path. He told himself to finish the floor, to stay to the rhythm of work, to let the law take its own course. Yet beneath the sound of the mop and the low murmur of people arranging their truths, there was a small, stubborn voice. It did not wear a suit. It did not carry briefcases. It said simply, stand when others will not. Marcus did not expect the world to rearrange itself so quickly. One moment the courthouse hummed its usual low chords, paper, footsteps, the soft thud of heels, and the next, everything fell into a stillness that felt deliberate like a held breath. It happened when a tall man in a charcoal suit stood up from the council table and walked out without a backward glance. The man had been quiet all morning, talking in measured sentences that gave the impression of control. He wore an expensive watch and carried an air of certainty like a shield. People assumed the shield was there to protect the man at the table, Michael Hale. But shields are fragile. Someone only needs to test them in the right place. The lawyer's shoes made no sound on the marble as he crossed the room. He paused at the doorway, as if the motion of leaving required a small, private apology, then stepped into the sunlight and disappeared among reporters and the clatter of cameras. There's a sound like a dropped glass in the benches. Murmurs folded into the air. A woman near the back put a hand to her mouth as if she could catch the sound and stitch it back together. Michael's face closed like a book someone had slammed shut. His jaw tightened until the vein at his temple was drawn thin as a rope. He looked at the empty chair where his counsel had been, and then at those around him, searching for any face that would wear steadiness. An assistant whispered something and fled. The bailiff frowned and made a call on a gray phone that never seemed to yield answers. The judge rose and said a word that meant delay, and the press began to push forward, hungry for a reaction. Marcus watched it all from the margins with his rag in his hand, feeling the atmosphere change like a street light switching from warm to cold. He had seen abandonment in small ways, a friend who stopped calling, a landlord who forgot a payment plan, but this was a new scale. The law was supposed to be a temple of promises. Watching one promise unmade felt like watching the roof give way. Michael did not panic aloud. There was a brittle calm about him, the kind that sometimes precedes breaking. Marcus saw both the public man and a private exhaustion he could taste in the set of Michael's shoulders. Up close, the billionaire's eyes were not calculating the way company press releases suggested. They were raw, the kind of tiredness that money could not smooth out. He folded his hands on the counsel table and pressed his fingers into the leather briefcase as if trying to root himself in something solid. Then came the whisper that moved faster than the official announcements. Someone said the lawyer had walked out because of a call, an urgent, private call that changed everything. Another voice said the firm had received a payment they could not refuse. Someone else said, loud enough for Marcus to hear, that it was a betrayal. The word hit the room like a stone thrown into a quiet pool, sending ripples across faces that each reflected some version of surprise and calculation. The impartial observer notes the small, concrete details that linger after a scene like this: a smear on the counsel table where someone had rested an elbow in worry, a crumpled legal pad with a hastily crossed-out note, a name scribbled in the margin, and then erased. Marcus crouched to pick up the pad because it slid toward the floor like a confession. The paper smelled faintly of ink and coffee, and in the top corner was a sticky note flapping like a small white flag. Someone had written 3 letters on it in a hurried hand. LEG. He did not know what the letters meant, but they stuck in his mind like gum under a bench. Sometimes secrets announce themselves in fragments. Sometimes a small, meaningless thing gathers weight until it becomes a map. After the lawyer left, Michael rose slowly and muttered that he would find counsel, that he did not need theatrics. People leaned in, cameras angling for the microsecond of human drama. Michael's voice was steady, but there was a tremor under the syllables like heat under a sheet. When he laughed, an almost embarrassed sound, it did not reach his eyes. Marcus watched him, and the janitor's mind, stubborn with old loyalties, tried to make order of the fragments. A man abandoned in court, a briefcase left on the table, 3 letters on a sticky note, voices saying betrayal. Marcus felt his chest tighten around a question: who leaves a man standing when his life is at stake? He thought of his own small betrayals, promises to himself he had postponed, entrance exams not taken, calls not returned, and the way those small things sometimes accumulated into a tide. There was a part of him that answered the question without thinking. The part that had learned how to stand didn't wait for permission. The crowd's mood turned merciless and hungry. Reporters circled with microphones held like hunting spears. A man in a blue suit who claimed to be a legal analyst offered sweeping judgments into a camera while trying to feel righteous. Michael sat very still while his empire's rumor machine began to spin. People threw out phrases: cover up, settlement, blackmail. Each guess was a small blade scraping the court's varnish. Marcus returned to his work, though he moved differently now. He cleaned in a precise rhythm, as if washing away the idea that the day would continue unchanged. He wiped at fingerprints on the counsel table until his rag was dark with other people's impressions. He emptied the trash with careful patience, listening to the court's conversations float like paper lanterns in a night wind. Sometimes, when the world rearranges itself, it is not the loud moments that signal the change, but the quiet decisions that follow. Before he left that evening, Marcus knelt by the counsel table and opened the briefcase that had been forgotten in the rush. He did it slowly, almost as if the leather might respond to gentleness. Inside were documents in precise stacks, a fountain pen that had seen better days, and tucked beneath a folder, a thin envelope with no name. He slid his thumb beneath the flap. There was nothing inside but a single photograph: Michael at a factory ribbon cutting, shaking hands with men in hard hats. Michael smiling, hands dusted with artificial cheer. Someone had written on the back in the same hurried script as the sticky note. Watch them. Marcus did not understand the whole of what he had seen. He only understood the shape of it. A man left without defense, secrets gathered like loose stones, and a note that said watch. It was a small, strange set of instructions that left his heart pounding with the same tight, certain beat that had driven him to act before. Loyalty, once started, is difficult to ignore. He closed the briefcase and set the photo back, where he found it. Then he pushed a mop across the courthouse floor, marking a clean line through the day's dust and the first thin tracks of what Marcus felt deep down would become a storm. Marcus learned people's stories the same way. He learned the courthouse by touch and patience. He watched them from the edges, reading small gestures. How a woman smoothed her skirt 3 times before speaking, the way a man folded and refolded his hands until the skin shone. People revealed themselves in repetition. He had watched Michael Hale repeat certain motions since that first day, the same tight smile, the same practiced breath before answering a question. Now those motions were fraying. "I don't understand why he left," Claire Bennett said, quietly coming to stand beside Marcus while he folded a stack of battered chairs. Claire was Michael's assistant. She wore a soft blouse and a face that held concern like something fragile. Her voice carried the kind of tiredness that belongs to people who have carried someone else's schedule for years. He walked out, Marcus said. His voice was low, careful. He did not want to add noise to a room that already hummed with it. Left his client. Claire's fingers wrapped around a paper cup as if to warm them. He called someone. He looked different. A shame, maybe. She glanced toward Courtroom 3, where property and fate met in dry syllables. Daniel Price has been with Hale for a long time. I can't believe he would. Betrayal is quieter than people expect. It is not the scream it sometimes becomes in memory. It is a small, decisive motion like closing a door and leaving a lock turned. Claire's worry tasted like that to Marcus. She wanted an anchor, someone to tell her this was a mistake. Marcus wanted different things. He wanted to know who is left when ties unravel. The impartial voice notes facts plainly. Daniel Price had been Michael's counsel for nearly 5 years. He had represented deals that made headlines and settled disputes that otherwise would have become disasters. His exit from the courtroom became a headline in the courthouse corridors within minutes. People whispered about money, about a text message that arrived at the wrong time. Gossip lengthened into accusation. Michael sat with his hands folded. He spoke to no one unless necessary. When he finally said something, it was for Claire. "Keep the schedule," he told her. "I don't want more calls." His words were a shield, small and human, not the polished statements of a corporate release. Marcus watched Michael's profile and wondered where a man's private weather ends and his public storm begins. Marcus had his own skinned history of dependence and disappointment. He had once trusted a person who promised to help with school fees, only to be left with empty words and overdue bills. Those small betrayals had taught him to watch loyalties as one watches the weather. Notice the pattern, but be ready when storms arrive. He felt a kinship with Michael now that surprised him. It had nothing to do with money. It had everything to do with being seen, and then at the worst moment, unseen. Across the hallway, Judge Reynolds called a short recess. People shuffled out like leaves. Tom Miller, the bailiff, barked orders in a soft voice that suggested comfort rather than command. He had known Marcus for years, and his nod to the janitor was an acknowledgement of shared civilization, small, functional, true. Marcus felt steadier for it. Even steadier was the odd quiet between Claire and Michael, a fragile civility that barely covered the tremble beneath. "You don't have to do this alone," Claire said, surprising Marcus with the softness in her voice. "You shouldn't have to. I will tell the truth plainly." Marcus did not seek heroism. He sought fairness. The line between the two is thin, but it exists. There was something about Michael's hollowed composure that pressed at him like an urgent need. Perhaps it was anger at the world's quickness to leave a man in the dark, or perhaps it was that Marcus knew abandonment like a second language. Either way, his sympathy had become a small, hard resolve. Claire left on errands. She moved with the quick efficiency of someone who carried other people's crises as part of a job. Before she disappeared down the corridor, she slipped Marcus a small, nervous smile. "If anything happens," she said, "be careful. Some of the people here aren't just curious, they're hunting. The word hunting made Marcus feel cold in a way he rarely did. It was one thing to have strangers ask questions, it was another to be preyed upon. He folded the last chair and stood, motioning a small vow to himself that he would remain present, if only to ensure the courthouse did not forget how to hold a man. Meanwhile, murmurs shifted into subtler moves. A security guard checked the briefcase again. A court clerk whispered into a phone with shaking composure. Someone pulled Michael's files into a private room to read what the public might not see. Inside the leather stacks Marcus had handled, there were contracts that mentioned companies with initials that matched the sticky note, LEG. The letters tugged at the edge of his mind like a half-remembered song. The impartial observer records another fact. People are messy in predictable ways. They perform politeness while calculating advantage. Claire performed loyalty. Daniel's departure read like strategy to some observers and like betrayal to others. Michael performed vulnerability badly and honestly. Marcus performed the honest thing of watching, then choosing to act. That night, Marcus walked home thinking of small things. The smell of lemon cleaner, the scrape of his shoes, the way the city's lights boxed the dark into neat squares. He thought of his mother, who had once told him that people often fall short, but sometimes someone steps forward and makes a difference. He thought of Michael, of Claire, of the absent lawyer, and of the 3 letters on the sticky note. He did not know yet what form the coming storm would take. He only knew the courthouse had put a man in his path, and Marcus had always been the kind to stand when others vacated the room. The shape of his decision was simple and unadorned. Stay awake. Watch. Do not let silence become consent. Outside his window, the city breathed. Inside, his resolve warmed like a small lamp. The story, like the city, would not be quiet for long. Marcus stayed late that night because the courthouse felt like an unfinished sentence. The lights in the main hall hummed low, and the echo of his mop was the only honest sound left. He moved slowly, letting the building settle around him the way you let a tired animal curl on your feet. He told himself it was duty. The truth, more private and blunt, was that he could not stop thinking about the briefcase and the sticky note and the photograph that said, simply, watch them. When he set the briefcase on the council table the second time, the leather smelled faintly of rain and disinfectant. He sat on the far end of the bench and opened it with fingers that did not quite trust their own curiosity. The fountain pen clicked against a stack of crisp pages. There were ledgers with neat columns, notarized forms, and tucked beneath a thin legal pad, an envelope with nothing written on the front. Marcus slid his thumb under the flap and found a bundle of receipts tied with a rubber band. At the top was a wire transfer slip, Daniel Price, recipient, Langford Everett Group, sender, an amount large enough to make a house change hands. He read the line again, like someone reading a date wrong. Daniel Price, the man who had walked out, the man who had been Michael's voice in court for half a decade, had a transfer on a table that made it look like he had been bought. There was a small prick of heat at Marcus's neck. He had not expected the shape to be betrayal. In his world, betrayal came in slow inches. A friend who forgot a promise, a neighbor who turned their back. This was surgical, fast like a clean cut. The receipts were not the end. Tucked beneath them, wrapped in tissue like something fragile, was a letter with a single line underlined. Ensure the withdrawal before the testimony. Public exposure would be costly. Marcus sat back on the hard bench and tried to remember which version of the world he had been living in. The one where promises could fail, but intentions remained pure? Or the one where money bought silence and men who had led lives of standing turned at a price? He had wanted to defend a man because he assumed abandonment meant weakness. Now, abandonment was revealed as a decision someone else had purchased. He remembered the 3 letters on the sticky note, LEG, and they lay on the page like an accent he had finally heard correctly. Langford Everett Group, a name he had only seen as a headline on the courthouse board. A different feeling rose in his chest, not pity alone but cold anger. The impartial observer notes that the slow accumulation of small details often proves the truth: a wire transfer, an underlined instruction, the absent lawyer's hurried shoes. Something shifted in Marcus. The line between guardian and instrument thinned. Had he been warming himself against a stranger's misfortune? Or had he been stepping into a conflict he did not fully understand? The answer arriving in his mind was not simple. Michael might be a man abandoned. He might also be a man with enemies who cut in the dark. He rose to slide the papers back into the briefcase when a sound stopped him, the whisper of footsteps, too light for the main hall. Marcus flattened himself against the shadow of the bookcase and watched Claire Bennett appear in the doorway. Her face was the same soft concern he had come to know, but her hands trembled with a small panic. She spoke into her phone in low, clipped tones. "No, he left. He walked. Yes, it looks bad. I don't have the files with me. Yes. Keep Langford informed. Tell them the withdrawal happened right before noon. Say it was his decision." Claire's words punched at Marcus with the force of a hand on his chest. He had believed her worry was genuine. He had believed in the way she had urged care and whispered warnings about hunters. Now she was speaking into the dark with a calm that belonged to someone reporting, not consoling. Marcus felt something severe and personal turn under his ribs. He stepped forward, making his presence known in a way that carried the soft thud of being suddenly seen. Claire's face turned as if she had been slapped by the light. "Marcus?" Her voice went thin. She ended the call with one quick motion and forced a smile that did not meet her eyes. "I thought you left." He set the papers down, the receipts showing like small bones. "You told me to be careful," he said. "You said people were hunting. Who did you mean?" She swallowed and looked at the council table at the open briefcase. For a moment her loyalty and something else, fear, perhaps, fought across her face. "There are factions," she said finally. "People who want the trial public. People who want it settled quietly. I'm caught in the middle." Marcus let the words sit between them, heavy as a verdict. He had seen clauses and signatures. He had heard a careful, businesslike conversation that felt like a map being redrawn in real time. The benevolent assumption that Michael had been abandoned by indecent men slashed into a harder truth. This was not simple abandonment. It was a calculation. People had chosen. Claire reached out, half apology, half plea. "Marcus, you don't understand everything. Some things are bigger than what you see in this room." He did not let the explanation smooth the edges. "Then tell me what I don't see," he said. She closed her eyes, and for once the world lost its practiced composure. "Daniel Price was offered a deal he couldn't refuse," she whispered. "Langford made a call. They offered Daniel protection, money, threats. He said he walked, but he had no choice." And her voice broke. "They told him if he didn't, they'd release something that would ruin more than hail." Marcus listened. The impartial voice notes this plainly. Claire had been both inside and used. Daniel had been bought or blackmailed. The pulling hands reached higher than a single courthouse. The human heart sees beyond facts to the ruin the facts make, a life's repute, a family's name, the quiet of a man whose hands trembled. Marcus's first instinct, fierce and immediate, warred with a new, slower understanding. If men could be bought, if threats could turn loyalty into desertion, then standing to defend a man was no longer purely noble. It could be dangerous, foolish, or even complicated. The choice to act required new knowledge, sharp as a lawyer's pen. He folded the receipts back into the envelope and, with hands steadier than he felt, closed the briefcase. The building seemed to inhale around them. Outside, the city lights showed through the courthouse windows like a field of eyes. Marcus felt small and exposed, a sentinel who had stumbled into a larger map. Claire's betrayal, or her confession, had changed the shape of his resolve. He walked home that night not with the simple warmth of someone who thinks justice will be easy, but with a cautious plan forming like a small, stubborn ember. If the world had been rearranged, he understood now it had been done with carefully placed hands. To stand for Michael would not be only about protecting a lonely man. It would be about picking a side in a war whose rules he had only begun to see. The phone in Marcus's pocket vibrated like a small animal startled in the dark. He was half asleep on the couch, the day's mop rhythm still echoing in his bones when he fumbled for it. The screen showed an unknown number. He almost let it go. Some calls were only echoes of worry. He answered. "Stay out of it," a voice said, flat and patient as water. "You don't know what you're touching." The line went dead before Marcus could ask who it was. He sat there with the phone, light, soft against his palm, feeling the words like a chill that moved from his fingers up into the middle of his chest. The city outside his window made a soft, constant noise, tires on wet streets, a distant siren. But in his apartment, it was as if someone had switched off the lights. Fear is a small, honest thing. It sits and waits. Marcus turned the phone over in his hand and thought of Claire's warning to be careful, of Daniel's sudden exit, of the receipts that smelled like purchase and strategy. He had wanted to do the right thing. The voice on the phone reminded him there were costs. "I will tell the truth plainly. Threats do not always look like violence. They often arrive as soft, precise instructions meant to rearrange a person's life from the inside." Marcus knew that. He also knew his own stubbornness, the same trait that kept him scrubbing a stubborn stain until it yielded. He slept badly that night, the image of the briefcase under the courthouse light looping behind his eyelids. The next morning, the courthouse felt sharper. The press had returned in thicker numbers, their questions folding into the air like small knives. Michael Hale arrived with a different posture. His suit was a little looser, his smile more practiced. Reporters clustered like moths. A young journalist thrust a recorder forward. "Mr. Hale, can you comment on the payments to Daniel Price? Will there be a settlement?" Michael's answers were short, measured. He talked about plans, about respecting due process, as if words could hold a building up. After the reporters withdrew, he lingered near the council table, and Marcus found a moment to speak. "You'll get someone," Marcus said quietly. Michael looked at him with an intensity that surprised Marcus. "You shouldn't be here after hours," Michael said. "It's not safe." Marcus felt the old kinship again, that odd thread of shared exposure. "Maybe," he replied, "but the courthouse is my world. I know where the light switches are." A laugh escaped Michael, small and tired. "I'm supposed to be the one with answers." He rubbed his temple. "I don't like being the one with questions." The impartial observer records that people react to pressure in different ways. Some puff up and speak loudly. Some shrink and become precise. Michael tried to remain precise until his voice faltered. He had calls to return, meetings that could determine the future of companies and lives. Marcus watched him weigh options like a man placing coins on a scale. By noon, the external pressure turned inward. Marcus found a folded note tucked behind the soap dispenser in the men's room, a place he checked out of habit. The paper was plain, the message plain: "Mind your business." The letters were cut from a magazine and pasted, the ransom-style mockery not lost on him. He felt the same prick of cold as the night call. Whoever wanted him to stop had chosen methods meant to unsettle and embarrass. The clerk's mouth told him these were not idle threats. Claire found him after that, eyes harder than before. "They called the board," she said. "Langford wants Hale to sign a confidentiality clause. They want to pressure him into stepping down. If he refuses, they'll leak documents that will destroy reputations." She paused, voice small. "They called Daniel cooperative, and they mean he's protecting them. They're consolidating." Marcus listened and felt something heavy settle in his chest, the sense of being part of a machine that ground people under policy and fear. "Do you want him to fight?" he asked. Claire's face loosened in a small, private way. "I want him to have a choice." She sounded like someone who had never been given one. Marcus's internal conflict deepened. Defend the man he had decided to stand for, and risk being caught in forces beyond his understanding, forces that mailed threats and whispered into phones. Step back and let the world decide without him. Both choices felt like betrayals of something important. He thought of his mother's hands, the way she had placed a small hymn Bible on his chest when he left home years ago. She had taught him that some things were worth the risk of discomfort. That evening, Marcus saw how public pressure translated into private coercion. A man in a dark suit waited outside the courthouse as people filed out. He watched Marcus from across the street, then approached with the cleanly measured footsteps of someone who never wanted to be noticed. "You know when to stop," the man said, voice like leather. "You help in the building, you keep the floors clean. You do not stick your nose into the papers." Marcus felt anger rise like heat. It was a small, honest anger, the kind that made hands steady and voice clearer. "People deserve someone to stand up," he said, "even if they have money." The man smiled without humor. "Even if they have money," he echoed, and there was no warmth in it. "Even if they do." After the man left, Marcus looked up at the courthouse windows, bright with office lights. He imagined a chessboard, pieces moved by hands he could not see. He felt his place on the board both tiny and newly important. The impartial observer notes, plainly, Marcus's life had shifted from domestic rhythms to high-stakes moral choice. The threat was real. So was his resolve. That night, he did not sleep well, but he slept with a plan forming. He would not be reckless. He would gather facts instead of assumptions. He would talk to people who had been inside the machine longer than he had. He would not be intimidated by cutout letters and quiet men. Internal questions stayed with him. Did he have the right to step into a fight that would pull others in? Was courage merely a vanity when measured against weapons money could buy? He knew only that when a man stood in a room with no one to speak, something inside Marcus tightened and chose. It was not a grand choice. It was a small, stubborn thing like keeping a promise to a neighbor or returning a lost coat. But small things sometimes start avalanches. The courtroom felt smaller that morning, as if the ceiling had leaned in to listen. Cameras leaned forward like birds that had found a good scent. Light from the high windows cut the room into bars, and the air smelled faintly of old paper, coffee, and something metallic, the expectant tang, before a verdict. People rustled like dry leaves. Marcus stood near the back, with his jacket clenched in both hands, his heart a steady drum beneath his ribs. He could hear his own breath, as if it belonged to someone else. I will tell the truth plainly. He did not plan to become the story. He only wanted the facts to be seen. But sometimes facts need a hand that will not be afraid to place them on a table. When the judge called the court to order, the rustle folded into a hush. Michael Hale sat like a small island of calm, though the effort of staying calm showed in the thin line around his mouth. Claire sat to the side, her fingers folded so tightly her knuckles blanched. Daniel Price's chair was empty again, but there was a ripple of movement at the doorway as Tom Miller, the bailiff, spoke into his radio. Marcus felt the weight of every pair of eyes as if they were coins pressed to his skin. He had not rehearsed his words. He had not thought how a janitor might be heard in a room built to shelter lawyers and evidence. He climbed the few steps toward the counsel table and laid the briefcase, the photograph, the receipts on the polished wood-like offerings. "Excuse me, Your Honor," Marcus said, voice steady though his hands trembled. "I found these last night. They belong to Mr. Hale's counsel." A camera snapped somewhere the shudder of a gull. The judge's eyebrows rose, murmurs flickered. The impartial observer notes that courts rarely allow interruptions from the gallery. Protocol is their religion. Yet the judge, old with years of watching what people did when pressed, looked at the papers and then at Marcus with something like curiosity. "Mr. Carter?" Judge Reynolds asked. Marcus swallowed. "There are receipts, wire transfers, a note that says, 'Ensure withdrawal before testimony,' and a recording." He saw Claire's face change. It was the small, precise shift of someone who realizes a locked door is being opened. Marcus set a small device on the table, the recorder he had found tucked beneath the papers. "It has a voice on it. I can play it." For a beat, the room held its breath. Then, with the judge's cautious permission, the recorder clicked and a thin voice filled the space, an executive cool and precise, instructing counsel to withdraw, mentioning Langford Everett by name and threatening consequences if cooperation continued. The voice promised money, safety, and silence. The room's air changed. The reporter's pen scratched like nervous insects. Then came a second sound on the tape, Daniel's voice, weary and small, saying, "I can't. They told me about my daughter." that hushed the room the way a hand can hush a crowd. A roar of questions rose and fell. Cameras leaned. Michael's hands clenched, his jaw set. Claire burst into tears and then, like someone who had rehearsed courage in the dark, rose and crossed the room. She stood beside Marcus, hands trembling but eyes clear. "I told them what they wanted," she said, voice steadying as it found the truth. They, Langford, threatened to release personal files. They told Daniel to leave. They paid him. The first twist, Daniel bought or blackmailed, had been a whisper before. Now it was a fact alive in the court's light. People shifted. The impartial observer records. When power meets exposure, the first reflex is to shelter. The second is to fracture. Then another movement, unexpected and sharp. Daniel Price stood in the doorway, wet-eyed, his suit rumpled as if he had been running. He crossed the room with a man's shame and a man's resolve mixed together. "I'm sorry," he said, voice raw. "I took their money. I lied. But they told me Mr. Hale was going to expose Langford Everett's bribery in the textile contracts. They said if I didn't withdraw, they'd make sure my daughter's name was twisted until she had to disappear. I walked because they told me my family would be ruined." That admission landed like a hammer. People stared as if the walls themselves were listening. The second twist, that Michael was not merely a man defending himself, but a man about to pull at a thread that threatened a larger corruption, unfolded like a map. Marcus watched Michael's face change, not the corporate mask, but the human one. Relief, guilt, something like vindication. Michael stood, and in a voice stripped of press statements said, "It's true. I found evidence. I was going to bring it. I thought I could handle the fight alone. I see now I couldn't." Silence pooled. The judge, lips pressed, called the court to a temporary recess and ordered the sealed documents to be secured and an independent investigator appointed. Phones lit like tiny constellations as reporters rushed the doors. Outside, the city seemed to exhale. In the hallway after the courtroom emptied, Marcus and Michael sat on a marble bench, the echo of the day folding around them like a shawl. Michael's suit smelled faintly of tobacco and regret. "You saved me," he said simply. Marcus looked at him, the man who had both been targeted and dangerous, and felt the truth he had carried since the first mop of his shift. "I don't know if I saved you," he said. "I know I wouldn't let someone be abandoned without a voice." The impartial observer notes that justice rarely arrives in clean packages. It is messy, partial, and slow. Langford Everett would face inquiries, Daniel would need protection, Claire would have to answer for complicity even as she sought redemption. Michael's reputation would be bruised even as it found a new shape. Marcus had stepped into a world where choices had consequences he could not fully predict. Yet, the moral was clearer in the quiet. Standing up changes the room. It does not always fix the past, but it can open a door to truth. Marcus rose, feeling older and strangely light. He took his mop like a staff and walked back into the courthouse where light still cut the floor into bright strips. People would remember the picture of a janitor who would not look away. Marcus would remember the sound of the recorder, the weight of the briefcase, and the small, stubborn pulse inside him that had said in the dark, "I will defend him." ChatGPT said. The weeks that followed moved like a careful unwrapping. Subpoenas arrived, and Langford Everett's board meetings leaked into the press until the company's name sounded different in people's mouths, less invincible, more vulnerable. An independent investigator was appointed, and a task force sifted through the files Marcus had touched, the receipts he had found, and the recordings he had placed on the judge's desk. Daniel Price entered a protection program. Claire Bennett gave statements that were both confession and explanation. She answered for the choices she had made and asked, quietly and often, how to live with them. "I will tell the truth plainly. The world did not fix itself overnight. Power did not evaporate because a janitor decided to shine a light. The impartial observer notes that institutions move at the speed of their procedures, and those procedures are patient with delay." Langford Everett hired new counsel and disputed the claims. Some board members denied knowledge, others quietly resigned. The legal war would take months, maybe years. The court docket is filled with motions and countermotions. The press cycled through outrage and fatigue. Yet there were small, real things that changed immediately. Daniel's daughter, whose name Marcus learned was Emily, stopped receiving anonymous threats. She was placed in a safe house and later reunited with her father under guarded, uncertain joy. Michael Hale's public image bore new cracks, but also a new honesty. He stepped back from a handful of public appearances, cleaned houses, and started cooperating with investigators in ways that made people lean forward and listen. Claire began, slowly, to volunteer with a nonprofit that helped families who had been pressured by corporate power. Perhaps atonement had room to become purpose. Marcus watched these shifts from the steady place where he always worked. People who had once only glanced at him now nodded with more weight. Some called him a hero in passing. Others merely smiled as if they, too, had been changed by the possibility of truth. He accepted neither saintship nor special notice. He kept his rag and his mop and the silver cross around his neck. The tangible parts of his life remained the same. The meaning shifted. Inside him, the moral landscape was more complicated. He had acted because abandonment angered him, because he believed someone should not stand alone when their life was being decided. That impulse had been good and blunt, and not entirely pure. He had not considered, at first, the ripple effects, how exposing a thread could tear whole cloths and leave people cold. He had not wanted to be the instrument of wider pain. Yet the pain that followed was not the same as the injustice that had been hiding in neat ledgers. Marcus thought often of the recorder's thin voice and Daniel's whisper about a daughter. He thought about Claire's trembling hands and her final courage. He thought about Michael, who, despite billions and headlines, had learned the slope of vulnerability. On slow afternoons, he walked the courthouse halls and felt the small tremor in his chest that used to be called worry. Sometimes he worried that his interference had been reckless. Sometimes he knew it had been the only moral option he could imagine. The impartial observer would say, actions have consequences that are both predictable and surprising. Marcus's choice had pressed a wound that needed pressing. It created both healing and pain. That is how many truths work, like surgery, sometimes messy, sometimes necessary. One evening, months after the recorder had played in court, Michael found Marcus alone in the main hall, polishing the brass that always took on new fingerprints. He hesitated before speaking, like a man unused to finding the right small words. "I wanted to thank you," Michael said. The sentence was simple, and gratitude in Michael's voice sounded like someone learning a new language. Marcus set the rag down. "I did what I thought was right," he said. He could have said it another way, that he had wanted to punish, to unmask, to be seen. But his voice stayed plain. "I won't pretend it was easy." Michael laughed once, a small, unguarded sound. It wasn't easy for any of us. He looked at the courthouse as if reading its history in the scuffs of the floor. "You changed things. For better and worse, you made people choose." They stood there, two men whose lives had been pulled into a fight they had not originally planned. Marcus thought of his mother's hands, of the hymn book she had pressed against his chest, of the small lessons that had built his moral backbone. Keep your promises, speak for the unheard, and measure courage against care. In the weeks that followed, Marcus found himself at more hearings, sometimes simply as a witness to the truth he had helped reveal. People asked him why he risked so much. He answered the same way more than once. Because someone had to stand when no one else would. Because when the law feels like a room built of glass and echoes, someone must bring a broom and a light. The case never reached a neat end in the way movies promise. Settlements were negotiated. Some executives pleaded guilty, others fought on. Langford Everett's stock wobbled, and the company restructured. Daniel began rebuilding his life with Emily, small and cautious steps that felt sacred. Claire continued to make reparations in ways that sometimes hurt her more than anyone else. Michael Hale founded a small fund for corporate whistleblowers, a gesture that would not erase the past, but would offer a future for others. Marcus returned to his rhythms. He still hummed hymns under his breath, and sometimes he let himself pause at the council table, fingers tracing the grain of the wood. He had learned that standing up does not guarantee victory, but it can tilt the scale toward possibility. He had learned that loyalty is messy and that courage sometimes requires choosing the least convenient pain. At night, he would look at the photograph he had found, the one showing Michael shaking hands with factory workers, and he would think of faces, the faces of those who had been used and the face of the man who had been left alone at a council table. He kept the photo in his wallet, folded beside other small things, a bus pass, a worn-him page, a receipt from a diner where he treated himself once to coffee. In the end, he understood something quiet and stubborn. To stand is not to win every battle. It is to refuse the small, comfortable cowardice that lets others be consumed while we pretend to be busy. The courthouse returned to its rhythms, but now the light there seemed a little less harsh and a little more honest. Marcus kept his mop, his rag, and that private cross. He had no illusions about being a savior. He only knew, with bone-level certainty, that when the moment came, he had acted. That knowledge, plain, heavy, and human, was enough. If you found this story powerful, make sure to hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. Your support helps us bring more important stories to light.